January 12, 1945, before dawn, before the world woke up, the war in Europe was already ending. For weeks, the Eastern Front had felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. German soldiers in frozen trenches felt it in their bones, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and refuses to let you breathe. Somewhere beyond the white fields and dark tree lines, something massive was waiting to move, and when it did, it would not slow down. It would not stop. It would last only 23 days, but it would break Hitler's war forever. What came next was not a retreat. It was not a setback. It was a collapse. In the summer of 1944, the ground beneath Nazi Germany had already begun to crack. Operation Bagration smashed through the center of Hitler's Eastern Front like a steel hammer. Entire German divisions didn't fall back. They vanished. Tens of thousands were swallowed whole. Command posts went silent. Maps stopped making sense. Army Group Center, once the backbone of German defense in the east, bled out faster than at Stalingrad. By July, the German front was no longer a line. It was debris. While survivors staggered west, exhausted and hollow-eyed, the Red Army did not pause to celebrate. They were building something far bigger, something final. Along the Vistula River in occupied Poland, Soviet forces quietly crossed the water and dug in. Not one crossing. South, center, north. Each bridgehead looked small on a map. Each one was a trap waiting to close. Behind the trees and ruined villages, trains rolled day and night. Rail crews tore up tracks and rebuilt them in the Russian gauge, inch by inch, sleeper by sleeper. Supplies flowed forward: fuel, shells, food, spare parts. Tanks hid in forests. Guns were parked wheel to wheel beneath camouflage nets. Entire villages emptied so armies could assemble inside them. By autumn, over 2 million Soviet soldiers stood facing Germany. The largest force ever gathered in one place, and the world barely noticed. Hitler didn't notice either. His attention was elsewhere: Hungary, the Baltic, the Ardennes. In December, he gambled everything on a surprise attack in the west, draining his last mobile reserves. While Western newspapers followed American tanks and celebrated Paris, the Vistula Front stayed quiet. Fog grounded reconnaissance planes. Snow hid movement. Silence became a weapon. What the Germans could not see mattered more than what they could. The Red Army wasn't just stacking men and machines. It was building momentum, carefully measured, precisely timed. Rail lines now ran uninterrupted from deep inside the Soviet Union straight to the front. No unloading, no delays. Ammunition piled high. Fuel tanks filled. Everything needed for a long, violent push was already in place. It was war decided by preparation, not improvisation. German intelligence did try to warn Berlin. Reports arrived describing massive troop concentrations, endless trains, artillery beyond counting. The signs were obvious to anyone willing to look. But belief was another matter. At Hitler's headquarters, the warnings were waved away. He called it a bluff. A trick. The same words were repeated again and again: exaggerated, impossible, fantasy. Officers who insisted otherwise were mocked. One was told the reports belonged in an asylum. Even as the threat grew clearer, German units were moved away from the danger. Tanks were sent south. Divisions were shuffled sideways. Entire armies remained trapped in useless buckets because retreat was forbidden. The enemy was visible. The numbers were real. But denial became policy. On the front line, denial didn't matter. In the frozen fields east of the Vistula, a German infantryman stood stamping his boots, trying to feel his toes again. The temperature had fallen well below zero. Frost crept into every crack of his uniform. His rifle burned his skin when he touched it. Across the open ground ahead, the Soviet lines were silent. Too silent. For weeks, he had heard them engines at night, metal clanking, distant thuds as heavy guns were dragged into place. Now there was nothing, no birds, no wind, just a pressure in the air that made his stomach tighten. He checked his watch. Almost dawn. At 4:35 a.m., the world exploded. The first shell slammed into frozen ground with a flash that turned night into fire, then another, then thousands more. The horizon vanished behind a wall of flame and smoke. The ground didn't shake, it heaved. The air punched the breath from his lungs. Earth collapsed into his foxhole as if trying to bury him alive. There was no build-up, no warning rhythm. The barrage arrived at full force, relentless and crushing. Trees snapped and vanished. Dugouts folded in on themselves. Men screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar. The bombardment went on, time dissolving into noise and pressure. Blood ran from ears. Frozen mud filled mouths. Survival became the only thought left. When the guns finally paused, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Snow had turned black. Bodies lay where units once stood. Some moved, most did not. Then the guns started again. By afternoon, entire battalions were gone. Radios were dead. Wires were cut. Orders, when they arrived at all, came too late. Positions meant to be held were already overrun. Roads were crawling with Soviet armor. The retreat became a scramble across open fields under low grey skies, chased by engines that never seemed to run out of fuel. This was not a breakthrough. It was a flood. Within days, Soviet tank armies were advancing faster than German commanders could draw new lines. 30 kilometers. 40 every day. Through snow, mud, and shattered towns, strongpoints were bypassed. Cities were surrounded and left behind. There was no pause to reorganize, no chance to recover. Warsaw fell and was passed without ceremony. It was no longer a prize, it was just another marker on the road west. What German soldiers saw as endless waves was something else entirely. This was movement layered upon movement. First blows shattering the front, second waves pouring through the gaps, fresh forces following to keep the pressure on. There was no moment to breathe. Behind it all, the trains kept coming. As the Red Army surged forward, the German rear turned into chaos. Civilians fled west on frozen roads, dragging carts and children through the snow. Columns stretched for miles. Some never made it. The war no longer followed rules. It followed momentum. By the time German forces reached the Oder River, many understood the truth too late. This was not another offensive to be contained. It was the end of the Eastern Front. In just days, the distance Hitler once conquered in years was erased. The Red Army stood closer to Berlin than anyone thought possible, and the guns were still moving. 23 days. That was all it took. The morning of January 13th brought no rest. Snow continued to fall in heavy, grey sheets, blanketing the landscape in a deceptive calm. German survivors shuffled through villages emptied by flight or destruction, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, faces pale from cold and fear. Every step forward was measured against the constant hum of engines, the distant echo of artillery, the occasional scream carried on the wind. They were moving through a battlefield that had already ceased to be one. It had become a killing ground. Behind them, the Red Army pressed relentlessly. Soviet tank columns rumbled through the snow, their tracks carving deep furrows into roads and fields alike. Artillery positions, invisible until the first shot poured shells in perfect synchronization. No hesitation, no pause, just a tide of men and steel that seemed unstoppable. Across the front, operational brilliance was revealed not in the bravery of individual soldiers, but in the orchestration of millions. Deep battle doctrine, years in the making, was unfolding in real time. First echelon shattering the line, second echelon exploiting every breach, third echelon sustaining the momentum. For the German defenders, it was overwhelming. Officers shouted orders into the icy wind, only to watch their units vanish into the white landscape. Communication lines had been severed, radios were dead. Every map was out of date the moment it left headquarters. Yet still, men fought, clinging to discipline, and the desperate hope that their comrades might hold the line somewhere ahead. By January 15th, the pace of the advance became almost incomprehensible. Soviet forces were moving 30 to 40 kilometers a day, through winter mud and snow, past cities that had been declared fortresses yet were bypassed entirely. Warsaw, a city that had endured 5 years of occupation, fell into Soviet hands not as a conquest but as a waypoint. Civilians fled in terror, cramming roads with carts, horses, and sledges, while aircraft strafed and artillery smashed. Thousands froze to death. Tens of thousands were trapped or drowned. The human cost was staggering, but for the Soviet command, the operational machine continued without pause. Inside German command bunkers, panic spread as reports arrived too late to be useful. Hitler, still fixated on distant campaigns in Hungary and the West, continued to strip reserves from the collapsing front. Generals pleaded for reinforcements, for tactical withdrawals, for anything that might stabilize the situation. They were ignored. Orders came back that made no sense. Entire divisions were transferred sideways or sent into doomed positions. The front line crumbled not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because strategy had failed them. On the ground, men like Feldwebel Heinrich Krauss watched their comrades fall one by one. By January 16th, his battalion had been reduced to a handful of survivors, moving through snowdrifts that reached their knees. The cold was merciless, seeping into bones and splitting fingers. The wounded froze where they lay, abandoned because the living had to keep moving. His platoon stumbled past farmhouses set ablaze, past the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. Each mile westward was a battle for survival. Meanwhile, the Soviet offensive showed no signs of faltering. Bridgeheads along the Vistula had become arteries of supply and firepower. Artillery barrages softened every position ahead of advancing armor. Tank armies carved corridors through defensive lines, turning strongpoints into isolated pockets. Entire cities were enveloped in hours while the main force pressed forward. The speed was staggering, 480 kilometers in 23 days, winter conditions, enemy forces in place. France in 1940 had taken longer for less ground. By January 17th, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The city was evacuated, and still, the advance did not stop. Bridges, roads, and rail lines behind the spearhead allowed supply and reinforcements to flow, as if the winter had no effect. Every checkpoint passed was another step closer to the heart of Germany. The German command structure was disintegrating even faster than its frontline units. Orders were contradictory, intelligence reports dismissed, and reserve funneled to places where they could no longer influence the battle. Fortress cities, once seen as bulwarks of defense, became tombs or irrelevant obstacles. Entire garrisons were locked inside walls, unable to alter the tide as Soviet columns bypassed them with terrifying speed. By January 20th, operational art reached its apex. Encirclements formed naturally as tank armies cut off escape routes. Artillery pinned enemy positions, and infantry exploited every gap. The rhythm of breakthrough, exploitation, and advance played out simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers. German soldiers felt it as chaos, Soviet planners knew it as precision. The calculations, the logistics, the railway conversions, the concentration of firepower, all these invisible gears turned with the momentum of inevitability. On January 23rd, the cold claimed Mora. The remaining German defenders, shelters offered warmth but never enough, huddled together. Some froze in their sleep, bodies locking in fetal positions as the Red Army approached within kilometers. Every night was a gamble. Who would survive until dawn? Who would be left behind? For the survivors, the march continued, each step a test of endurance, each breath a silent defiance. By January 30th, the offensive had reached the Baltic coast, turning roads and rivers into highways for advancing tanks and infantry. Refugees crowded the landscape, struggling against snow and ice, many never reaching safety. Meanwhile, the German command could only watch as operational depth rendered their strategies obsolete. Supplies, reinforcements, and reserves were already too late. The Vistula-Oder offensive would not slow until the Soviet forces had consolidated along the Oder River, just 60 kilometers from Berlin. In 23 days, the Red Army had advanced faster and farther than any army in modern history, breaking through entrenched defenses, bypassing supposed strongholds, and leaving entire formations shattered behind them. 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery had turned preparation into devastation. Hitler's Eastern Front was finished. Berlin loomed ahead, the final prize not yet touched, but already trapped within the momentum of an unstoppable machine. And in those 23 days, the world had witnessed not merely the destruction of armies, but the execution of decades of planning, doctrine, and operational art, an offensive whose scale and speed would eclipse all else in human memory, yet be strangely forgotten in the West. The Red Army paused, only to regroup, repair, and prepare for the final march toward the Reich. Behind the front, the wreckage of Army Group A and countless units testified to a truth German soldiers had already learned. Survival depended on speed, cunning, and a cold acceptance that the world had shifted irreversibly. The morning of February 1st, 1945, dawned over a landscape that no longer resembled the Eastern Front anyone had known. Forests had been reduced to jagged stumps. Villages were piles of rubble, blackened by fire or flattened under the weight of tanks and artillery. Snow, once pristine, was churned into mud and ice, dotted with the remnant of shattered vehicles and the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike. The air itself seemed heavy with the smoke of burning buildings and the metallic scent of blood. German soldiers who remained were few. Command structures had collapsed. Units had dissolved into wandering bands, clinging to life and the faint hope that somewhere the tide could be halted. But it could not. The Soviet advance, 480 kilometers in 23 days, had become unstoppable, an ocean of men, steel, and fire moving across the frozen landscape. Every day they pressed further west, cutting off escape routes, enveloping cities, bypassing strongpoints, and leaving devastation in their wake. On February 2nd, the offensive officially paused at the Oder River. The Red Army needed to consolidate, to secure its northern flank in Pomerania before turning its full attention to Berlin. But this pause was not a retreat. It was a moment to prepare for the next act of destruction. Behind them lay the shattered remnants of Army Group A, 450,000 men, 4,000 artillery pieces, 1,100 tanks, but as coherent formations they no longer existed. The opening bombardment alone had destroyed 2/3 of the 4th Panzer Army's artillery and claimed a quarter of its troops before the first ground assault. Entire divisions had disintegrated into fragments, retreating through snow and ice, abandoning equipment, and leaving civilians to fend for themselves amidst the chaos. Across the Oder, the survivors faced the full reality of operational art applied with precision. Where the Germans had relied on strong points and rigid lines, the Soviets employed depth, mobility, and concentrated firepower. Breakthroughs were not isolated events, they were engineered, rehearsed, and executed with the cold logic of a clockwork machine. First echelon forces shattered defenses. Second echelon troops poured into the gaps before defenders could regroup. Third echelon units maintained pressure, preventing any counterattack from forming. It was a system perfected over decades, executed flawlessly, and devastatingly effective. For the men on the ground, the human cost was immense. Soldiers marched through snow that reached their knees, every step a struggle against exhaustion, frostbite, and hunger. Their uniforms froze stiff in the night. Small shelters offered warmth only temporarily, and even there, men succumbed to the cold in their sleep. Those left behind frozen, wounded, or dead were quickly forgotten in the rush of retreat. Feldwebel-Kraus, whose battalion had been reduced to a handful of men in the early days of the offensive, now moved westward with only 25 survivors. They were shadows of their former selves, faces drawn, bodies battered, and spirits frayed. Every morning brought the same question: how many would survive until nightfall? Each night, the answer became smaller. 6 more men froze to death in a barn one night, their faces locked. In expressions of peace, as if the cold had claimed them gently, Kraus had no time to bury them. Soviet forward elements were less than 5 kilometers behind. Survival required movement. The Soviet advance was relentless. Tank armies plowed through forests and fields. Artillery barrages softened every obstacle, and infantry exploited gaps faster than German forces could respond. Fortress cities, once considered bastions of defense, were bypassed or rendered irrelevant. Brelo, designated as a stronghold, became a trap for 80,000 German soldiers, their presence meaningless as Soviet forces flowed past. Commanders ordered no retreat, clinging to doctrines that the enemy had already rendered obsolete. Entire garrisons became tombs, their sacrifices unable to slow the momentum of an army moving with both precision and overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the logistical backbone of the Soviet offensive remained invisible but indispensable. Trains continued to deliver fuel, ammunition, and supplies directly to the front line. Thousands of kilometers of track, converted to Russian gauge, ensured that tanks and artillery could maintain their tempo without pause. Artillery parks multiplied in forests. Tank armies gathered in empty villages. The combination of careful planning, engineering, and relentless execution transformed what might have been a brutal slog through winter into a methodical, unstoppable machine of war. By February 5th, the Soviets had extended their reach across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. German forces, fragmented and exhausted, could only watch as cities and towns fell with astonishing speed. Warsaw had already been bypassed. Major industrial centers fell like dominoes, unable to mount effective resistance. Retreat became chaos, a desperate scramble through snow and ice with little hope of regrouping. Soviet columns, moving at 30 to 40 kilometers per day, had created gaps the German commanders could neither fill nor close. Every strong point lost was another nail in the coffin of the Eastern Front. The human toll extended beyond the military. Civilians were caught in the path of the advancing forces, their lives upended by the sheer speed and scale of the offensive. Refugees trudged westward across frozen roads, dragging handcarts, sledges, and children through driving snow. Temperatures fell below -8 degrees Celsius. Many did not survive the journey. Horses collapsed, wagons broke, and people froze where they fell. The destruction was compounded by Soviet air attacks, artillery strikes, and the general chaos of an entire front in motion. Maritime disasters followed, such as the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustave, a refugee ship carrying over 10,000 souls, including women and children. Within 50 minutes, more than 9,000 perished in the icy waters of the Baltic. Tragedy eclipsed by the momentum of the offensive, but not forgotten by those who survived. By mid-February, the operational rhythm of the Red Army had become almost a natural force. The coordination of artillery, infantry, and armored units allowed for simultaneous breakthroughs, exploitation, and encirclement across hundreds of kilometers. German units, no matter how brave or disciplined, could not match the combination of mass, speed and precision. The Soviet advance was not just about material superiority, it was about doctrinal mastery, a deliberate execution of deep battle principles conceived years before and perfected in the field. In contrast, Hitler's Eastern Front had become a lesson in the consequences of willful ignorance. Reports detailing the concentration of Soviet forces, the state of their supply lines, and their operational readiness had been dismissed as bluff. Generals who advocated consolidation or tactical withdrawal were ignored. Panzer divisions were diverted to secondary theaters. Entire formations were locked into untenable positions, left to face annihilation. Fortress cities, once symbols of resistance, became irrelevant air. The Soviets bypassed or enveloped them with terrifying efficiency. The psychological strain on German soldiers was immense. Exhaustion, hunger, and cold combined with the constant presence of an advancing enemy to erode morale. Every day was a struggle for survival. Every step westward brought the possibility of death either from combat or the elements. Communication breakdowns left men isolated, relying on instinct and experience rather than orders. Feldwebel Kraus and his remaining platoon continued to press forward, moving through snow-laden fields, past frozen bodies, and burning villages. Each night, the cold claimed more lives. Each day, the Soviets pressed the advantage. Despite these horrors, the operational efficiency of the Red Army remained staggering. Artillery concentrations reached unprecedented densities, with some sectors experiencing over 250 guns per kilometer. Tanks and infantry moved in perfect synchronization, exploiting every breach and preventing any German unit from consolidating. Rail networks supplied fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements with precision. The offensive was a symphony of destruction, every component working in harmony to achieve a singular purpose: the collapse of Hitler's Eastern Front. As the offensive approached the Oder River, the scale of destruction became even more apparent. Entire German formations had ceased to exist as coherent entities. Divisions that had begun January with thousands of men were reduced to mere fragments. Artillery and tanks were lost in the first hours of bombardment. Strong points were bypassed, leaving defenders isolated and exposed. The speed and scale of the advance ensured that no city, no natural barrier, and no remaining force could slow the momentum. The Oder itself became a highway for Soviet operations, frozen and traversable for tanks and heavy equipment. By February 10th, the German rear was in total disarray. Supply lines had collapsed. Communications were nearly non-existent. Refugee columns clogged roads, further hindering any attempt at organized withdrawal. Fortress cities fell one after another, not through direct assault but by encirclement and isolation. Commanders were powerless to influence outcomes. Orders arrived too late or were ignored entirely. The Eastern Front, once a symbol of German strength, was now a wasteland, its defenses shattered, its soldiers scattered, and its cities abandoned or destroyed. The speed of the Soviet advance defied all previous expectations. From the Vistula to the Oder, 480 kilometers had been covered in just 23 days. The average daily advance of 21 kilometers was sustained despite winter conditions, entrenched enemy positions, and the logistical challenges of moving millions of men and thousands of vehicles. During the exploitation phase, advances of 30 to 40 kilometers per day were common, surpassing even the celebrated Blitzkrieg of 1940. This was not improvisation. It was the realization of a doctrine years in the making, executed with precision and discipline. Behind the spearheads, the wreckage of the German army told the story of operational art in action. Army Group A, reduced from a formidable force to fragmented units, could not slow the Soviet juggernaut. Entire divisions had been destroyed or scattered, abandoning equipment, ammunition, and positions. Roads and fields were littered with the remnants of a once mighty army. Yet the offensive continued, driven not by numbers alone but by coordination, planning, and the ruthless application of doctrine. By mid-February, the focus shifted to Berlin. The Oder River line represented the last significant obstacle before the German capital. The Soviets paused only to consolidate supply lines, repair infrastructure, and ensure that momentum would not be lost in the final push. Behind them, the Eastern Front, as Hitler knew it had ceased to exist. The combination of speed, operational depth, and precise coordination had shattered the defensive capacity of Germany in the east. The civilian population bore witness to the devastation. Columns of refugees stretched for miles, moving through snow and mud, trying to escape the advancing armies. Many perished along the way, succumbing to cold, exhaustion, or attack. Towns and villages burned. Infrastructure was destroyed. Yet despite the human cost, the offensive continued with relentless efficiency. Operational tempo was maintained. supply lines kept flowing, and every advance was exploited to its fullest extent. By the end of February, the Eastern Front had been irrevocably transformed. Berlin lay within reach, the Soviet armies positioned to strike the final blow. Army Group A was destroyed as a fighting force. Divisions that had once held the Vistula line were gone, replaced by shattered remnants. The offensive had demonstrated the power of operational art, deep battle doctrine, and logistical mastery. It was a campaign executed with precision, speed, and devastating effectiveness, leaving the Germans reeling and the world stunned. The Vistula Oder offensive, though often overlooked in Western narrative, stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in military history. Over 23 days, the Red Army had advanced 480 kilometers through winter conditions, against a fully equipped enemy, and with a level of coordination and planning that surpassed all previous campaigns. The scale of destruction, the precision of execution, and the human cost were staggering. Yet for the soldiers on the ground, the experience was immediate and visceral. Snow, ice, fear, and the relentless pressure of an enemy that would not stop. In the wake of this offensive, the lessons of deep battle doctrine, operational depth, and logistical planning became clear. The Soviet army had demonstrated that victory depended not merely on courage or numbers but on preparation, coordination, and the ability to sustain momentum across vast distances. The destruction of Army Group A and the collapse of the Eastern Front were not accidents of history. They were the result of decades of planning, years of preparation, and the ruthless application of operational art. As historians later reflected on these events, the scale and speed of the offensive became almost incomprehensible. 480 kilometers in 23 days, cities bypassed or destroyed, armies shattered, supply lines maintained under winter conditions, millions of lives affected, countless soldiers and civilians lost. And yet, for decades, the narrative in the West often ignored these achievements, focusing instead on the campaigns in France and the Ardennes. The operational brilliance of the Soviet offensive was overshadowed by ideological narratives, leaving its lessons underappreciated for generations. But the numbers do not lie. 2 million soldiers, 1,100 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and a meticulously prepared supply network had achieved what was previously thought impossible. The Eastern Front had been broken. Hitler's armies, once considered invincible, were in full retreat. Berlin lay just beyond the Oder, and the final chapters of the war in Europe were about to be written. And so, in just 23 days, the Red Army reshaped the map of Eastern Europe. It erased divisions, shattered armies, and rendered entire defensive strategies obsolete. It demonstrated the power of preparation, coordination, and operational art. For the soldiers who survived, it was a march through hell itself. For those who watched from afar, it was a transformation of the war they thought they knew. And for history, it became a testament to what meticulous planning, discipline, execution, and sheer determination can achieve on a scale never before seen. The Eastern Front would never recover. Hitler's hopes of defending the Reich had crumbled. The speed, precision, and devastation of the Soviet advance had set the stage for the fall of Berlin. The battlefield had become a vast, frozen crucible where entire armies were tested, broken, and redefined. And when the guns finally fell silent along the Oder, the world had witnessed one of the most extraordinary military feats in history. 23 days that broke Hitler, 23 days that ended the Eastern Front, and 23 days that reshaped the course of World War II. If you want to truly understand the scale, the courage, and the horrors of the Eastern Front and how a single, meticulously planned offensive changed the course of history, watch the stories of the men who survived, the cities that fell, and the armies that vanished into memory. The Red Army's march was more than a campaign. It was a demonstration of operational art, the lethal marriage of strategy, logistics, and human endurance. It left Germany reeling, millions displaced, and the path to Berlin open. The lessons of those 23 days echo through history, yet remain largely unseen in popular memory. It was a victory born not just of numbers, but of vision, preparation, and the relentless will to execute a plan with precision unmatched in modern warfare. This was history's turning point in the East, a brutal symphony of fire and steel that would decide the fate of millions and end Hitler's grip on the Eastern Front forever. And as Berlin waited on the horizon, the world began to realize that no fortress, no strategy, and no amount of desperation could withstand the force that had been unleashed in those 23 days. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most decisive operations, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow our channel for more cinematic, in-depth stories from history's most gripping battles. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment shocked you the most in this story of survival, strategy, and relentless advance?